Hello, everyone, both here and wherever you're watching. My name is Steve Erlanger. I'm the Chief Diplomatic Correspondent in Europe for the New York Times. And we have a very good panel here. It's a panel with a catchy title, which is Democracy and Technology, Catch Me If You Can. As I say, outside the window, we have the beautiful site of ancient Greece, which is very moving, I think, to anyone. But it reminds us that there actually was a form of democracy before social media. And so it is possible. The big question is, what is social media doing to our democracy? Is it making it better? Is it making it worse? And the minister just gave a very good speech, I think, full of accomplishment about how the Greek government is using technology to help the health of its population and get it vaccinated. But one can also ask the question of whether social media is damaging democracy, whether it's putting us into silos, whether it's creating false communities, malign communities. One can ask the question how it can be regulated. Can we catch up to technology? So this is what interests me, but we have a really good panel, and I will just introduce them down the line very, very quickly. To my far left, who will speak first, is Yuval Harari, who's, I think, very well-known historian, author, man who has had the courage to think big thoughts, which is great, which is something I wish journalism would do a bit more of. So it's a great pleasure to have you here. And next to him is Dubravka Šuica, if I got that right, I hope so, who's a Croat Vice President for Democracy and Demography of the European Commission, so very important. And then, of course, next to me is the Minister of State and Digital Governance of the Hellenic Republic, as well as the simplification of administrative procedures, which is very important, Kyriakos, which I've ruined, but I apologize. So, Yuval, what do you think? Is this a help to us? Can we keep up with technology and democracy, or is it going to destroy us in the end?
Well, I don't know. It's up to us. Technology is not deterministic. What should be very clear is that democracy in its essence depends on technology. And you mentioned ancient democracy. And the thing to realize about ancient democracy, it was never large scale. Until the age of modern communication systems and mass media, it was absolutely impossible to have large-scale democracies. So you have small-scale experiments, like in Athens or like in Rome. They never expanded beyond a single town or city. The Athens built an empire, Rome built a bigger empire, but the empire wasn't democratic. Because to have a democracy, you need to have a public discussion. And in the absence of modern communication systems and modern mass media, it was simply impossible to have a public discussion about government policy, let's say in England in the 12th century. So you could not have a kingdom-wide, a country-wide democracy. Only the introduction of the new communication technology of the modern age enabled democracy to exist, at least on a large scale. And when we look at the history of the last 200 years or so, we see that in reaction to technological changes, there is a pendulum movement between democracy and dictatorship. That some types of technologies favor democracy and some types of technologies favor dictatorship. In the second half of the 20th century, the prevailing technology favored democracy. And this is why we saw the spread of democracy all over the world. But the big danger now, which we should think about and address, is that there is no law of nature which says that every new technological development will necessarily favor democracy. And there are some technological development, especially AI, which seem to be inherently in favor of dictatorship. It makes it easier to rule centrally and not through a distributive system. So this is one big issue that I would like to raise. Now, with regard to social media, I think that inherently it's a force for good, because the key question is how do you include more people in the conversation? In ancient Athens, to have a public conversation, you needed to limit it because it was simply impossible for everybody to talk at the same time. So it was only upper-class males. And the last 200 years, we see with new technologies, more people joining the conversation, more groups. Every time a new group joins the conversation, it destroys old institutions and certainties and causes chaos. And it seems bad, but in the long run, if it's managed properly, it is a force for good because it means more people take part in the conversation.
Great. That's a very good start. I hope we'll get back to this, but let me ask the commissioner. In her work, I mean, Brussels, we've heard, likes to think of itself as the great regulator, the Brussels effect, you know, that we may not be powerful in some things, but boy, we can regulate the world. That's kind of the European ethos. Can Europe continue to do that in a useful way if it doesn't create its own digital platforms? I mean, if it's just trying to regulate everybody else?
First, I want to thank you for this question. Does this work? I hope yes. There is no better place to discuss on this but Athens. So thank you for having me here today. It's not up to me.
And can you just pick up your microphone maybe and speak into it? That's better, yeah.
It's better, no?
Yeah.
Not yet.
Can you just hold it and speak
Yeah,
it?
but I cannot.
This happens in every discussion on technology.
I know. I'm a Luddite. I'm afraid. I can hear you.
Maybe you can start with Minister because they haven't fixed this.
Okay, fine. So, as I said, you have given a very good take on how to use it for social ends, but of course it can be used for governmental ends, and it can be used for the ends of governments that aren't so friendly too. So I'm curious, as you plan your digital strategy, how much defense are you building into it? I mean, how are you trying to protect the larger democracy that technology makes available from intrusive use from outside?
First of all, policy making in our case, us being a member of the European Union, is obviously a function of decisions and discussions made at the central level, at the EU level. And I think this is something extremely beneficial in our case, because certain technologies can be regulated, discussed, debated at a larger scale than that of a member state solely of the European Union. But having said this, this is, let's say, the landscape that you operate within. In our case, we tried to do it, and I will answer tautologically, by doing it. In a sense, you project your values on the technological equation. And my role is called the Minister of Digital Governance, but in reality it shouldn't be the Minister of Digital Governance, because digital governance is a tool. It's not an end. It's not the KPI. It's the means through which we try to solve a problem. So the question is, what is the problem? And by asking this question, you project your values in the equation. The problem, the way we framed it, is service design, state processes. How do you make the lives of citizens easier in day-to-day interactions? Others might have asked a different question, but this is the European question, and this is, in our case, the Greek question. And this is why I think we managed to be quite successful in answering it, because we were quite specific at asking the right thing.
Yes, but I mean, I just want to go back to what I asked you, which is that there are malign influences in the world who want to manipulate the digital space and use it as a tool of national projection, national power, of disorder, of disinformation. So that's the question I'm asking you. How do you protect yourself from that?
In reality, is what you said before. You said that the European Union on many things is trying to regulate, but this is not a bad thing. It's a good thing. And the way in which the European Union regulates certain amongst these activities, because in my view they cannot be regulated at the on a national state level or a state level. They should be regulated at the EU level and in a sense become more comprehensive at the national level. What we have done is that we're using this toolkit. We used it in a full spectrum of technologies, not only the ones that you mentioned. The way, for instance, 5G networks were rolled out in Europe was a function of a 5G toolkit produced by the European Union. Each country made its own sovereign decisions, but it happened in a context, and the context was set on a European basis. So at the end of the day, the answer comes from this regulation.
Okay, very good. Commissioner?
First of all, I wanted to thank you for inviting me here, and to be today in Athens is really something which coincides with my role as Commissioner or Vice President for Democracy and Demography. So there is no better place than this one to debate or deliberate on this topic. May I start with one anecdote? I was in Estonia before start of COVID, and I had a similar exchange of views with the person who was advisor to Estonian Prime Minister at that time, and he was advisor for digitals. And the title of our exchange was, "Is the future of Europe digital?" And then we asked people around tables, and then he said, "No, the future of Europe is analog." Although he was in charge of digital. So this is what you said earlier in your statement. So digitals are very important, and I think without digitals we cannot understand today's world. And this is what we are doing at the moment with the conference on the future of Europe. So as you know, I'm in charge of the conference on the future of Europe on behalf of European Commission. And without digitals and without multilingual digital platform, this wouldn't be possible. We wouldn't have been able to start it during pandemic. So digital platform is for us hub of the conference. It's in 24 different European languages. Artificial intelligence is there, translating immediately. And now we began to gather the results. And results are also gathered not only by human beings, but also by artificial intelligence and putting it in different drawers. So we are experiencing this in situ. So this is happening at the moment. And may I use this opportunity to invite all of you to come to Multilingual Digital Platform to see how it works, because it is very important. And regarding manipulations, which you mentioned, yes, there are some manipulations. We have moderation on this platform, but very low, very small number of examples were deleted, if I may say so, because there were hate speech or something which was fake news. But people don't tend to misuse this platform. This is very important to express your views. So someone from Greece, from Greek island, can communicate to someone from Denmark or from Estonia, and it is simultaneously translated into their native language. So this is real bottom-up exercise, and we want people from all spheres of life, not only Brussels bubble, but or Athens bubble. We want people from all walks of life to be there, and this is completely inclusive, completely transparent and open. So we use digitals in its full potential here.
Which is important, because of course one of the big questions, I would say criticisms, but one of the big questions about this European Union is the democratic deficit, which is real. I mean, it may be less a little bit now with the European Parliament, but still, Ursula von der Leyen flies in on the basis of choices made by a couple leaders, not on the basis of any democratic process. I mean, she's confirmed by Parliament. So the use of digital to get European opinion for the notion of a European future, I think is great. It's nice to think you think there's a European future. That's encouraging also. But I do want to come back. I was thinking about my own country, the United States. We've had 2 elections with Russian meddling in our democratic affairs. The German Bundestag has been hacked by Russians. We have Chinese doing spying. We have Chinese using AI as Yuval started to say. I mean, if Biden is right and if there is some sort of competition, doesn't have to be a conflict, but a competition between democracy, which is what we're talking about, and authoritarianism or illiberal democracy using AI, it's a serious issue. So Yuval, can you talk a bit more about how you see this progressing?
Well, what we are seeing now is basically a start of a new digital Cold War between the US and China. And they control the field. I mean, Europe is relatively behind in technological terms. If you look at the 10 big companies which dominate this technological field, they are all either Chinese or American. I mean, Europe is not really in the game. And we see the emergence of a new kind of imperialism, if you like, based on who controls the flow of data in the world. This is now the name of the game. This is the most important asset. If you control the data of a country, and if you control its digital infrastructure, then you control its most vital assets. You don't need to send the tanks in if you can take the data out. Just imagine the situation in 20 years when somebody in Beijing or in San Francisco, Washington, knows the entire personal medical history of every parliament member, every judge, every military officer. This is the kind of future we are looking at. And people understand it in some capitals in the world, but not in all the capitals, and that's another big problem. And maybe the most important problem is that by its very nature, AI tends towards authoritarianism because it makes it far easier to concentrate all the data and all the information in one place. What made the Soviet Union extremely ineffective as an economy, as a system, is that it was simply impossible to collect. I mean, they tried to collect all the data in one place, analyze it there, and make decisions. And this was far less effective than the democratic model of distributing the data and the power and the decision. Once you bring AI into it, it becomes much easier. There might even be an advantage to the authoritarian way of doing things. So that's a very big issue. And the other point is that there is a problem of algorithmic opacity. I'll explain what it means. That AI makes decisions in a fundamentally different way than human beings, than the human brain. If you think about something like who to give a loan to, like you apply to the bank to get a loan. If it's a human being making the decision about you, the human collects some data about you, your credit history, if they are racist, maybe your skin color, whatever, and makes a decision on the basis of 2 or 3 data points. And you can then ask, if you didn't get a loan, you can ask, why didn't you give me a loan? And you can understand the reasoning and object to it. But AI makes decision in a fundamentally different way, which is supposed to be its big advantage over humans. So when the AI makes the decision not to give you a loan, by definition, you can't understand why the bank said no. I mean, they can print out millions of pages of data and tells you this is why. In principle, you can't understand the decision process. And the big question is, how do you maintain a democracy when more and more critical decisions are made in a way that humans just can't understand? Not because somebody is trying to hide it from you, but because your brain is simply incapable of understanding this.
And also, I suppose, because we all think of ourselves as relatively unique as opposed to data points. But for the AI, we're just a data point. I mean, they don't really care.
A lot of data points.
A lot of data points. No, because there's a book I recommend to everyone by a German who has spent 10, 15 years in China and speaks Mandarin, named Kai Strittmatter. and it's called We Must Be Harmonized. And it's a very, very good look at how China uses information, AI, to encourage social behavior, to punish bad behavior. You need to have certain points to buy an airline ticket, and the way it kind of monitors what people think, frankly, and the way it affects how people think. And I don't mean to go on about this, but I mean, it just seems to me there's a dark side to this that I just want to feel that Brussels is getting. Does Brussels get it?
So, of course, that there is a dark side, but we think positive, definitely, and we want to use the advantage of digitals. This is the idea, and this is what we are doing at this moment. As I told you, okay, democracy can be spoiled, as you said, but at the same time, it would never be only digital democracy. It could be only a source of help, social media, as we know, influencing our societies, but at the same time, we have to have good education from the very childhood in order to make our citizens aware what is good, what is bad. So education, I think, is here very important. And this is the reason why we are trying to teach children from kindergarten to be European citizens and to take part into democratic processes. This is what we want to do. This might sound a little bit utopistic, but this is how we see proper European citizen, and this is the idea. And this is the reason why 1/3 of all those who will take part in the Conference of the Future of Europe will be from 16 to 25, because we are preparing this world, this Europe, for this generation. This is not by coincidence that a Recovery and Resilience Fund is called Next Generation EU. So we cannot talk about them without them. So we need children and we need young people, and this is how we see this Europe.
I kind of like Next Generation EU. I must say, Fit for 55 always seemed more like a yoga studio slogan than an EU policy, but hey, that's just me talking. When you think about European democracy, Minister, I mean, in a way, it's by definition unequal, right? I mean, you know, every country has a veto, but there's absolute majorities. It's based to some degree on population, based to some degree on wealth. So how does a country like, I mean, does a country like Greece feel that this Europe can be fully democratic for itself? And does technology help this somehow? I mean, yes, you can get your voice in the council and so on, but it's not the same as having 80 million Germans.
I have to say, referencing what you said before, that European policy sometimes resembles yoga. But having said this, look, on a cost-benefit analysis basis, every member of the European Union feels, apart from the cultural aspect, because we feel that we're part of that same family, we feel that we gain much more by being present at the table rather than being outside. So having said this, obviously there is always a population factor or a population element, but the voice at the table is there. And it has been there on many things. And to give you one example from my portfolio, on all digital policy discussions, we feel that we're being heard, and we feel that we can influence the design of certain projects. For instance, I mentioned 5G. I had the chance to present to Vice President Vestager the way we launched 5G, the 5G auction in Greece, and it was considered to be a case study for Europe overall, the way in which we used the auction to create a market. We created a venture capital fund from the proceeds of the auction in order to generate activity in the 5G sphere. And by the way, on what Yuval Harari said before, on AI indeed, you don't have that many European companies, but for instance on 5G, which is the neural network of the new era, the key competitors of Chinese technology are European companies. So technological progress can sometimes be a little bit anecdotal depending on the founder or the researcher. So in reality, what we're trying to do is that we're trying to leverage our strengths, and leveraging those strengths can be much, much more beneficial at the European scale rather than the national or the domestic scale.
Sure. Also, I mean, people do, I have to say, in Brussels, praise your recovery plan, which was one of the first to be approved. One of the big things I watch to see if the Commission can handle is monitoring all this spending. It's not always so good at that. You know, once it's in the hands of governments, it tends to disappear from at least Brussels' eyes. So I think this will be really fascinating to watch. The last topic, just before we end, I want to get to is, you know, it's complicated. Marietje Schaake talked about it a bit this morning. It's regulation. I mean, can we regulate something as diverse, as difficult, as easy to manipulate as the digital sphere, as social media? I mean, can Facebook do it? No. Can governments do it? I mean, people like Bruno Le Maire keep saying, oh, well, we need government regulation, you know, the way we regulated the railroads. But I mean, it's a little more complicated than regulating railroads. So I'm curious what any of you think is possible, or is this something that, as often happens, government is just going to lag behind? It's always regulating the last war, so to speak.
It's evident that technology is always faster than governments and than laws. So this is really something which all of us see. But it doesn't mean that we haven't, that our obligation is not to follow. So we have to follow and to be as fast as possible. I think regulation is, to some extent, is good. But since you mentioned yoga, it's hard for me now to continue in this European way. So I think we have to regulate to some extent, but otherwise we have to let people express their opinions, their views. And what I haven't said at the beginning, the reason for starting this exercise on deliberative democracy is that we notice that there is a gap between policymakers and citizens. And we want to somehow decrease the role of this so-called Brussels bubble. So we want to narrow this gap between us, policymakers, and citizens, and we want them to have their say, and this is the reason why we are including them, and we are coming back to Athens. But as you said, it was possible only for a small number of people, but by having digitals, large number of people or citizens can be on board, and this is what we are aiming at. And then it's not to abolish representative democracy; it's to empower members of parliament, members of European Parliament, is to strengthen them with the voice of citizens. Although they say we are elected directly by citizens, we don't need any citizens, but we need citizens because 5 years period in between of two elections is too long period, and not to listen to them in the digital era. Maybe in history, yes, but now we need prompter and faster decisions and exchange of views. And this is why we are doing this.
Great, thank you. Yuval?
No, I think it's still possible to regulate. And this should be the job of politicians and governments, not of the companies. And politicians and governments still have enormous power. Again, you should just look at how the Chinese government is regulating its own technology. Now, I'm not suggesting copying exactly what they say, but what they do, but it does give a very clear example that between governments and corporations, if governments are really know what they want, they still have enormous power. Part of the problem in places like Europe is that the governments are not sure what kind of policy they want with regard to regulation, and this is because it's not part of the public debate. Like I've been watching, say, the elections in Germany, and you see that I don't know what's the difference between the different parties in their ideas about AI. I think that potentially AI is the most important subject politically at the moment, and I have absolutely no idea what, say, the difference is between Democrats and Republicans in the US about their policy on AI.
Well, one thing I know, if one party's for it, the other one's against it.
That's true, but who is for what? I mean,
that I know.
Or you think about, I don't know, choosing a Supreme Court judge in the US, such a big thing. They ask what they think about gay marriage, about abortion, gun control. What do they think about regulating AI? Potentially, the most important decisions that these judges are going to take will be about regulating AI. And the parties who are kind of pushing these candidates, they don't even stop to ask this question. And that's a very big problem, because if you don't have a public discussion about it, you can't really expect the government to regulate it because it has no idea what the policy, what the public wants.
Mr. Minister, last word, if you want it.
It's not a question about whether we will regulate. It's a question about how we will regulate. Regulation is a given. Sometimes, by the way, you don't necessarily have to be a follower. To give you one domestic example, 5G technology applications, some exist, but most don't exist yet. And it's not the role of governments to devise them. It's the role of the market and the researchers. So the way in which we designed our approach, for instance, on the 5G auction, was in order to spur the maximum innovation that we could in our domestic market. So there you have a regulatory approach or a legislative approach or a policy approach, which is ex ante, not ex post. And you try to get the maximum out of the technological progress that will come. On most other fronts, of course, you come ex post and you try to regulate, let's say, out of the fire in regulation, you try to get the flame and get rid of the ashes. So what we're trying to do is to get the maximum positive impact and to minimize the negative impact. And to a certain extent, we have managed to do this, let's say, in the data protection sphere on a pan-European basis. The key challenge will be exactly what Yuval Harari said. We will try to do this in AI, and it will be a challenge.
Well, I just want to thank all of you very much, and thank you all for your patience, and the mass is ended. Thank you.